Here are 5 things that you probably didn't know that you could do with Zbrush. Gesture control to zoom in and out of an area in Zbrush, pretty handy stuff. Canvas single click to enter in solo mode. This one you will either love it or you'll hate it. Change the length of the cones control for the modifiers in the Gizmo. Probably one of the things that people never change just because they don't know they can. Improving the ghost and the transparency with a custom look so that it actually works for you, and custom polyframes so it is more clear. Let's get into it. Alright, so here we are in Zbrush. I'm using Zbrush 2026.2, which is the latest version at the time of this recording. But the things that I'm going to show you have been in Zbrush for a while. It's just that, again, people don't really know that they exist. So that's why I think this video is kind of like interesting. So I'm going to be using this demo dragon, a sketch that I did a few days ago to cover some of the brushes that I created for the scales, the scale pack. But again, that's a whole different thing. I have a video for that if you want to check it out. But the things that I want to show you live within the preference palette. So I'm going to click on this one and drag it to the right-hand side. And in here, we're going to start with the gesture control. So I'm going to open up the edit sub-palette right here. And this one is very important. It controls a bunch of things. But the one that I want to draw your attention to is this one right here. It's a simple switch. So if you enable gestures, you can control the zoom in and out of an area when you're working just by creating a little motion with your pen or your mouse. So I'm going to switch to a different camera here just so that you can see what I'm doing. All right, so I just switched the camera so that you can actually see the gestures with my hand. And I'm going to use 2 types of gestures, and basically those are the available ones. So if I press the Shift key, like so, you see that my cursor changes. Now, hovering over the area that I want to zoom, or any area of this character, I'm just going to go up and down. So Shift, up and down, and let go, and you see I'm zooming in into an area, and I can continue the sculpting. And if I want to zoom out, all I need to do is press the Shift key and go in circular motions like so, and it just goes out. Right? It takes a little bit of practice, but once you get used to, it could be one of those things that you either love or you hate. So again, to go in and out, I'm going to press the Shift key and go up and down like so, and it just zooms into an area that I want to sculpt, let's say the eyes. And if I want to zoom even more, I can keep doing it. I can press the Shift key up and down, and there you go, it zooms in. And if I want to zoom out, again, Shift and circular motions to go out. It's as simple as that. Again, one of those things that you might love or you might hate, but it is important to know that it's in there in case you want to use it. Now, the next one is going into solo with a single click. Again, it's one of those things that I personally really like, but you might not. So I'm just going to show you what it does, and then you'll try it and see if it works for you. So I have it in my UI here at the top. You see, I can click on solo mode, and I can isolate this subtool for the eyes if I want to work on just the eyes. However, if I'm working in kind of like full screen mode, which often I do like this, so I just press tab and work without distractions, what I can do is enable this allow click on solo. So that switch is right below the enabled gestures, which is why I put it as a second one here in this tutorial. So if I click allow click on solo, what I can do is now click on the canvas and it automatically goes into solo. So again, click again and it'll bring back everything. So I really like it because you can work in the normal way. So let's say if I want to switch to the head of this dragon, I can press the Alt key and click or left click, and that isolates this. But instead of pressing my shortcut or this button, I can just click on the canvas once, start working, change things in here. And if I want to go back, I just click again on the canvas. So very, very handy stuff. It can speed up your workflow, especially if you don't have a dedicated shortcut for it, or you don't want to have it in your UI. So in practical sense, let me just show you how I would work with this. I will collapse my windows here, or my palette, sorry. And then I go into tab like so. Let's actually go actual size so that we have more real estate. So I can work in full screen mode here. And then if I want to go into the eyes, for example, I just select it, click once on the canvas, and click once again to go back in. So head again, click once, go back in. The horns, select them, solo mode, click back in to go back. So again, it becomes something really handy. You either love it or you'll hate it, but give it a go and spend some time with it. I'm pretty sure that you'll find the value on knowing that you can go into solo mode just clicking on the canvas. Now, for the next one is something that is very relevant for, let's say, this character. Like I said, I have a video covering the entire workflow of this. But for the neck, if you can't be bothered going to the video and watch it, I'm going to show you why this is important. So I'm going to click on cylinder, and this is going to create just a simple cylinder. Let's switch to a material like so. And I'm going to bring in the gizmo, and I'm going to do something like the neck of that character. Right? So I started with a simple tube. And just to give it shape and to give it form, I brought in the gizmo. I went into the gear icon and I clicked on the bend curve. So the bend curve gives me this option, and you'll see I can switch or add new points, and I can move this around like so. right? And this is how I basically gave that dragon neck the shape. I can also select a point and I can scale it so that each one of these points have a different scale, and I can taper this one. Again, all of this is covered in the other tutorial. The point that I'm trying to show you is that you see how I obviously exaggerated this for the tutorial, but you see that the cones that I have, the controls, are pretty large. So you can change all of that, and sometimes by default, so if I go to the preference palette, and this time let's go ahead and open up the dedicated palette for the Gizmo 3D, you can actually change not only the size of the gizmo, which in this case you won't see it. Let's go back to the default, which is 300, but you can change the modifier's length. So that basically allows you to change these cones and make it easier for you to select. By default, in my opinion, they're quite tiny, so sometimes it's kind of like hard to choose. For instance, if I go for the bend arc, sometimes they look like this by default, and it's kind of like hard to select the one that you want. So if you go to the Gizmo 3D, you can increase the modifiers to your liking. I think it worked fine in this case, and then you can just click and change the modifiers. That's it. So if I go back to the gizmo, just as an extra little tip, you can change the gizmo size, and that actually changes the entire size of the gizmo. And also you can have smaller icons, so you can click on large icons to turn it off, which by default is on. And that's it. You now have a modified gizmo and an improved way of control the controllers or the cones for the deformers, which I think is very important. All right, so let's move on into the transparency and custom ghost situation, because this is one of the most important ones that I think will make a real difference in your workflow. So let's head back to the dragon. This will be a good example here. I'm going to turn off the poly paint so that it's easier to explain what I'm going to show you. So let's say that I'm using the standard brush and I want to push kind of like this area here around the top of the skull, so that there's no intersection with this fang that I created here, right? So the usual thing could be just go into solo mode, maybe press the Alt key and push that in, or it could also be a matter of bringing the move brush and then you can push that in. But in most cases, you will use something like the standard brush, like the clay brush, things like that. But you don't really see what is going on. And sometimes Zbrush is just going to kind of like take into account the other volumes, right? So if I just do this, you'll see how it is distorting this because it's looking at the fangs as well. So you definitely have to go into solo mode and tweak it, right? So one thing that I found that is really useful and that I've used for many years in my workflow is to enter the transparency with ghost. So if I click on transparency, it gives me that, by the way, I have the ghost enabled as well. So by default, if you click on transparency, you'll see this. Again, it's not exactly like this because I already changed my transparency settings. But if you go into ghost, you will see that you can see behind the fang in this case. And if you have this enabled, it doesn't matter that you have multiple subtools, let's say, over the mesh that you're editing, you will be able to just affect that without Zbrush taking into account the volumes of this. Now, let me explain this a little bit more because I know it could be a little bit confusing. So I'm going to switch to let's go for a sphere. And let's append to that sphere a subtool. So just kind of like recreating, let's go for a ring 3D. So I'm going to try to recreate something like what I had with the dragon. So the sphere would be the head and the ring 3D would be the teeth, right? So let's say if I go into the sphere and I go into this, standard brush, I want to start pushing things like in or out. But as soon as I get or hit in this case, the ring 3D, things are going to get really weird because again, Zbrush is looking into all the volumes that are visible, and that's how the brush is reacting. So that's not what I want. So if I want to just push things without, let's say, taking into account the ring in this case, I need to go into transparency and the ghost mode so that I can do this. So you see now I can keep doing this. And this is really, really handy for a lot of different situations. But you see the difference between having something visible or having it visible when you have the ghost and the transparency. Now, personally, I don't like the default settings of either the ghost or the transparency. So I'm going to show you how to change it and how to make it a bit more useful. Like I said, I've already changed this a little bit, but let's head back to the preference tab. And let's see if I remember the default settings. So in the draw subpalette, this is where you can change things. So first, I'm going to change the transparent depth. So you see, this allows you to change how much of that sort of white color you're seeing. And by the way, you can change that color here. So I prefer to have something bright so that I know exactly which is the object that I'm affecting. So I'm going to change it to like something like an orange, like a bright orange. And then I'm going to play with the transparency. So something like this. You can also change the front opacity, which is basically the strength of that color in a way. So I'm going to push it a little bit further. And let's actually push this back a tiny bit more. And the one that makes a real difference, which by default will be something like 0.5 or something, if I can remember, is this back opacity. So that way you can see behind the object. It could be useful in some scenarios, but I prefer to not having it. So I'm just gonna set this to 0, and that way I don't see behind the object. I just see wherever I want to, affect the model. This is particularly useful if you have like sculpted stitches, for example, and you just wanna add some bulging of the clothing or whatever the case might be around the holes of the stitches. So this type of thing is really useful. I just remember this from something that I worked on recently, and I use this. So I just wanted to show you these 3 simple sliders and a color that you can change to make the transparency and ghost a lot more useful for this type of stuff. I have a macro that I built for myself that allows me to turn on and off both the transparency and ghost. I usually don't use one or the other. I use them in combination. So I have them in here. So this macro only turns this on and off. So I can click off and I get out of that sort of transparency and ghost. And the same thing goes if I want to turn it on, right? That's it. If you don't want to build your own macro, you can actually leave the ghost on and then just have a shortcut for transparency. And because the ghost is kind of like dependent on the transparency, you just need to turn on transparency and that's it. I had a macro for a while, so I just used this one, but that's basically it, right? So give it a go, because if you can manage to get something that works better for the transparency or the ghost modes in ZBrush, it will speed up your workflow and it will be a lot easier. All right, and for the final tip of this video, I'm gonna show you how you can change the polyframe, again, to make it a little bit more interesting and easy to read. So let's jump back to the dragon here. And I'm gonna go into all low so that I have the lowest subdivision level. Let's head into the head and let's go into polyframe. So this is my polyframe, you can see. I'm gonna switch to the skin shade 4 so that it's a little bit easier to see what I'm showing you. And let's head back to the draw palette, because this is where you can change things for the polyframe. So I'm gonna enable this variable polyframe opacity. That's just basically changing the thickness of the lines depending of whether you have subdivision levels or not. But this one, is something that I usually have as by default. Now, the other thing that I want to do is kind of like recreate something that you will find maybe in Maya, for example, which is the Lambert gray color, and then you have the blue polyframe or the blue wireframe. So something like that. You can do whatever you want. I'm just trying to give you an example in case you're familiar with that. So in the polyframe color right here, this is the color of the actual outline. So you can change that to anything. So I just click once and it grab the color that I have here as my main color. So you see now my polyframe is white. So if I want to use something like the Maya color, right, something like that, I'm going to go for a blue like so, and then click once, and that will grab my my main color. Now, if I switch, let's say this to white, this is also actually giving me the polyframe color or polyframe ID. So I can hold Control and W to assign different colors. The outline won't change because the outline is driven by this color, but the polygon ID is just the random color that ZBrush assigns. However, if I don't want to deal with that, or I don't want to have different colors, I can go here where it says PF gray or polyframe gray, and that way it doesn't change colors. It still gives you different polyframe IDs or polygon IDs, but it's all in a gray mode. So if I go out of solo mode and then select something like this, you'll see we have that gray. Let's go back into this one actually, and then select all the different objects that this character has or this sketch has. But you see, it is always going to be gray until I turn this off, and that way it shows me the colors. But it's just an interesting way of working. Now, a couple more things to improve the polyframe. You see, it's still pretty fainted, the color of the lines. So you can click on this P frame, which is the polyframe color intensity, and you can set it up to something higher, like 100. And that's going to be kind of like thicker, more or brighter lines in here. You could also go to this polyframe fill and push it all the way to 100 to get the full amount of that sort of gray color. But if this is too intense, then you can just play around with this fill so that it's not that that much or like that intense, right? But this is what I was trying to kind of like give you as an example, that this is kind of like the Lambert version of Maya with the wireframe, right? It might be interesting, and you might think, well, there's no point of making it gray. The whole point of polygroups or polyframe is so that you can see the different colors and what object is what. So the other thing, or the alternative of what you can do, is turn this PF gray off all the way. You still have the ability to set this color to a different thing. That's just for the sake of demo, I'm gonna set it to red, right? And what you can do is go to this polyframe color saturation. And this allows you to reduce the intensity of those polyframes. So you still have a little bit of color going on, but it's not as obvious, right? So let's see the difference. Let's set it to something like maybe 9 just to see. So you see when I switch, they're slightly different colors, right? So I can really see the difference. I'm gonna do a quick render. That's how I can see the different colors. And you see the wireframe is obviously pretty prominent in this case, but between the neck and the head of this dragon, you have a bluish, dark gray, and a yellowish for the neck, right? So you can control all of that. Anyway, so hopefully this has been of help. This is not gonna change dramatically how you work, but those are little things that when you play around with it and you get familiar with it, it can actually enhance how you interact with ZBrush. And I think it's valuable to know that all of these things are already in ZBrush. You can find them in the preference palette and you can adjust it the way that you want so that it fits your workflow and how you like to see things within ZBrush. So let me know when you try them and how you go. And if you want to see the full workflow of this specific dragon that I used as a demo in this video, I have that video already set up in the channel, so go ahead and check it out. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.